You know what I never understood about the story of Noah's Ark in the Bible? Why do they make such a big deal about teaching it to kids? It's like every Sunday school class ever is all about Noah's Ark. It's like the most violent story in all of the Bible. I mean, sure, you got animals, 2 of every kind, 7 of some kind, going on to this ark and surviving. But like most of the animals are dead. I mean, if they really wanted to do a lesson about the ark, they should give the kids soup. And then the kids should pour a bunch of like animal crackers into the soup. And then when the kids are like, what are these animal crackers all about? You could be like, well, those are the corpses of all the dead animals in the flood. Just floating there, lifeless. No one has ever asked me to teach a Sunday school class to children. I don't know why. Hi, and welcome to this video on the flood account in the book of Genesis. In this video, we're going to do a few things. First, we're going to look at the world behind the text by considering an ancient Mesopotamian myth, the Epoch of Atrahasis. We're going to engage in a comparative analysis of the Epoch of Atrahasis with the Genesis flood accounts. After this analysis, we're going to take a look at the character of God in the Genesis accounts to unpack how does this character act, what does this character look like, does that surprise us? Finally, I'm going to offer 2 basic reflections on how the flood narrative in the book of Genesis can have meaning for us today. Seriously, dead animals everywhere. Fine, let's get started. I guess you don't care about the dead animals. The Epoch of Atrahasis is an ancient Mesopotamian myth. There's a set of 3 stone tablets, incomplete, fractured, from about 1700 BCE that tells of the narrative. The Epoch of Atrahasis itself, like the Genesis flood narrative, are based on older Mesopotamian myths. And there's a good chance that the Epoch of Atrahasis predates Genesis. Therefore, it makes sense to look at some of the themes from these narratives to better understand what's happening in the book of Genesis. So to begin, I'd like to offer a brief summary of the Epoch of Atrahasis. The epic depicts a time before humans. A number of gods inhabit the cosmos. Anu, the father god of the sky, Enlil, the god of the land of earth, and Enki, the wise god of the waters. There are other younger gods who care for the earth and dig out rivers, but the task becomes burdensome and they rebel against Enlil. To lessen the strain of the younger gods, the older gods suggest the creation of humans to do their hard labor. After what no doubt are some strange committee meetings, 14 humans, 7 male and 7 female, are created out of mud, the flesh and blood of a sacrificed god, and some spit from the rest of the gods. The problem is that humans get too numerous and, similar to the lesser gods of the Enuma Elish, make a lot of noise. Enlil is disturbed by their noise. The noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket. So, Enlil tries to eliminate humans to get some peace and quiet. He sends disease and drought, but his efforts are thwarted by Enki, who kinda likes humans, especially Atrahasis, and wants to see them thrive. Enlil decides to try a third method, a massive flood to destroy humanity. Enlil makes Enki vow not to warn the humans about his plan, and Enki consents. But Enki Big Fat warns them anyway. Well, Enki warns one human, Atrahasis, instructing him to build a big boat to survive the flood. Atrahasis does so, and brings 2 of every animal onto the boat to save them as well. The flood commences, and the epic tells us that it's so fierce that even the gods are afraid, and some even weep at the destructive force. But Atrahasis survives, no doubt singing, "I'm on a boat! I'm on a boat! Everybody look at me, 'cause I'm sailing on a boat!" during the 7-day deluge. After the flood, Atrahasis makes a sacrificial offering to the gods. The text says, the gods smelt the fragrance, gathered like flies over the offering. When the deed is done, Enlil regrets the violence he unleashed upon humans. Well, he regrets it until he learns that Atrahasis survived, then he just gets mad at Enki for helping humans. After the dust settles, the gods propose a new method for calling the human population. This includes making humans less fertile, including barren women, and allowing demons to inflict miscarriages on unborn infants. Now, if you've read the account of the flood in Genesis, you'll note some similarities. Let's unpack them. The first similarity is that humans present a problem to the gods. The second similarity is that the gods respond to this problem ultimately with a very destructive flood. The third similarity is that one human, a representative of humans, is selected to survive the flood. Another similarity is that this representative human builds a boat to survive the flood and brings on 2 of every kind of animal to help them survive as well. A fifth similarity is that after the flood, the surviving human makes a sacrifice. The gods gods smell the sacrifice, and this leads to a sixth similarity: the gods decide never to flood the earth again. These commonalities are important and striking, and they do suggest drawing on a common milieu of imagery and theme from the ancient Near East. However, there are also some notable differences between the Genesis account and the account of the Epic of Atrahasis, and other accounts that are very similar. For example, one of the tablets from the Epic of Gilgamesh. One is rather obvious. The Epic of Atrahasis ascribes to a polytheistic worldview. There are many gods doing many different things and sometimes at odds with one another. In the Genesis account, only one god is mentioned. Second, the nature of the problem that humans present to the gods is different. In the Epic of Atrahasis, the problem is that the humans make too much noise, and the noise is unsettling, especially to Enlil, who says, "I can't get any sleep." In the Genesis account, the problem isn't so much noise, but violence and wickedness. Before we talk about the character of God in the Genesis flood narrative, I want to make one point clear. In the flood narrative, we're dealing with a single canonical text. However, it seems to be drawing upon multiple source traditions. Let me point this out by looking at the text itself. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 13 and verse 19, the text states, "And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark, and of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind onto the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female." Two things are striking about this passage. One, the word that's used for God is Elohim, and 2, there are 2 of every animal that are brought onto the ark. Now look at a separate passage from the Genesis flood narrative. This one coming from Genesis chapter 6 verse 7, and then the first 3 verses of chapter 7. "So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. Then the Lord said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air also, male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of all the earth." 2 aspects of this passage suggest that it's coming from a different source tradition. One, you note that the word for God here is not Elohim, or in English, God. It's Lord, all caps, which remember goes back to that tetragrammaton, the divine name, Yahweh. The other difference that's really striking is that rather than taking 2 of every pair of animals onto the ark, here you take 7 of all clean pairs of animals and 7 of all kinds of birds. So there's a discrepancy on how many of each animal are taken onto the ark. Now, for our purposes, the only reason this is important is that it does highlight that we're dealing with different source materials that are being brought together by a final editor, most likely in exilic or post-exilic Israel, to give us this canonical version of the text. That caveat noted, let's look at the character of God in the flood narrative itself. Based on our reading of the Epic of Atrahasis, we note that there are different gods, and the gods seem to be somewhat at odds with one another. Enki really likes humans and wants to preserve them. Enlil is really annoyed with humans and wants to destroy them. That works when you have a polytheistic world. You can explain why one god floods, why one god saves. But when you switch to a monotheistic worldview, one god has to take on the characteristics of all of these other gods. And we see this in Elohim, or Yahweh. That is, God seems to have an ambivalence that captures all of the different characteristics of the gods from the Epic of Atrahasis. It is God who wants to destroy the world, like Enlil, and also God who wants to save the world, like Enki. So there's almost a sense of divine ambivalence occurring in the text, because one god is taking on the personalities of multiple gods. One of the most interesting questions that I found to ask of the flood narrative is, why did God flood the earth? Some of the common assumptions that I hear regarding why God flooded the earth are, 1, human beings were sinning and God punishes their sinfulness. 2, God is angry at the sinfulness or wickedness of human beings. And 3, God is just, and as a just judge, God must bring about this punishment upon human beings. These 3 assumptions fit well with many people's understanding or view of God, especially if they draw a very stark distinction between the God of the Hebrew Bible and the God of the New Testament, a distinction that I'm not quite as comfortable with because I don't think it holds up as well as most people assume. But never mind that for now. It's interesting to note that the notion of punishment, the notion of judgment, and the notion of anger, none of them are explicitly in the text itself. That is, Genesis 6 never mentions anything about God being angry, about God judging, or about God punishing. So what does the text state? In one of the source traditions, there is an emphasis on the wickedness of humankind, and even how every thought in their mind is evil continually. In another of the source traditions, the emphasis is on the violence that has corrupted all flesh. And so in some sense, the reason God floods the world is not simply wickedness or sinfulness as we might think about it, but violence. And this violence seems to extend beyond the human community to all flesh that is present on the earth. But how does God respond to this violence? Well, again, the text doesn't say anything explicitly about judgment or anger or punishment. What the text tells us is that God is grieved because of the violence, grieved because of the condition of the earth. And in fact, God is so grieved by the condition of the earth that God actually regrets the entire creation project. Let that sink in for a minute. In this mythological narrative, God is viewed as one who regrets the creation. That is, as one who wishes that God would not have created. There are a number of assumptions about God that are called into question with this idea. One, can God make mistakes? Is God looking at the world and thinking, this was an error, I shouldn't have done this? That seems to be implicit in the text. Two, is God timeless? Would not a timeless God be able to go back in time and undo what was done? But God seems here to be bound to what has occurred in time. God can't go back and undo the mistake of creation. Rather, God has to work with creation as it is in its unfolding narrative in time. These are interesting thoughts to consider, and they kind of throw wrenches into a lot of theological assumptions that people make about God. To summarize this point, people often look at the flood narrative in the book of Genesis and they see an angry judge. But God appears less as an angry judge in the flood narrative and more as a wounded lover, one who is grieved by the creation project itself and actually regrets the project wholeheartedly. Another interesting question to analyze the character of God in the text is, how does God respond to the flood after it occurs? Well, there's one point in the text where God remembers Noah and all the creatures on the ark. This notion of remembrance is also interesting, but let's set that aside for now. After the waters subside, Noah comes out, and as with the Epoch of Atrahasis, he sacrifices some animals. God smells the aroma of the animals and decides never again to flood the earth. There's almost an implicit notion of regret here. God sees the violence that God has caused, and like the gods of the Epoch of Atrahasis, decides maybe that wasn't a good idea. In this sense, there's a notion of divine regret that kind of bookends the flood. God explicitly regrets creating anything prior to the flood, and God implicitly regrets destroying the creation after the flood. Once God decides not to flood the earth again, God makes a covenant. Interestingly enough, this covenant is not just made with Noah. In fact, it's not even just made with the human species. As we noted in our previous video on covenants, it's made with all creatures of the earth. God enters into a covenant with all flesh, humans, animals, and so on. Carl, I feel like we should take just a few moments here to really lament the real victims of the flood. And let's be honest, that's the fish. I mean, could you imagine what it would have been like to be a fish? You're just swimming in the ocean, things are normal, all of a sudden there's this massive rain and the earth is flooded. And you're like, this is my time, right? I can go anywhere, I can do anything. I believe I can fly, or swim. And then all of a sudden it stops raining and the floodwaters start to subside. And all these fish are just flopping on the land like, this is bull. I'm just saying, it was a rough time to be a fish. God's violence is your benefit and God's mercy is your downfall. I feel for them, I really do. God's covenant is made with all creatures, and God also offers a sign of this covenant, the rainbow. I want to take a few moments here and talk about the notion of the rainbow. Anyone who speaks more than one language knows that things can be lost in translation from one language to the next, and translation always involves interpretation. The English word rainbow has no exact equivalent in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the word is kashet, and this word means bow, understood like a war bow, a weapon that you would use in battle. Now there's a number of valid ways to interpret the significance of the sign of the covenant, that is, the rainbow, but one way that is supported by the world behind the text, and sort of found some grounds in later Jewish interpretations, is the idea that we are talking about a weapon here, a war bow. As a weapon, a bow is a tool of destruction. However, it's only a tool of destruction when it's aimed at the enemy. And you can imagine if you were aiming a bow at the enemy, it would look something like this. Ping! You like that sound effect? It's pretty good? No? Okay. In other words, the bow has to be sideways, like this, to be a force, or at least pointed at the enemy. When a bow is not pointed at the enemy, it's not a threat. It can either be at rest, or if it's pointed away from the enemy, it can even be a sign of peace. That is, we are looking for peace, not war here. When it states that God sets God's bow in the sky, you'll note that the bow itself is no longer pointed at the earth. It's in a kind of resting position. So every time it rains and there's a rainbow, we are reminded that God has put down God's weapon and God has promised not to take it up again. This way of understanding the sign of the covenant was picked up in the 13th century by the Jewish rabbi Nachmanides. Nachmanides actually suggested that the bow was not only in a resting position, but that it was pointed away from the earth. He further noted that the bow has no string. In other words, it is harmless because it's lacking the necessary features to cause violence to someone else. So for Nachmanides, the image of the rainbow was again this notion that God has put down God's weapon. God is offering peace. And so to summarize the character of God, we do have this ambivalent God who regrets creating, who acts in violence, who kind of regrets the violence, who offers this covenant. There's a back and forth, and God is embodying all these different characteristics of the different gods of the Epoch of Atrahasis. But also we have this God who regrets, this God who seems to be stuck with the way the world unfolds in history, this God who makes covenants, makes promises, binds God's self to the world, these covenants that extend beyond the human species, but all creatures. And this God who also engages in violence that far exceeds the violence that humanity had caused on the earth. God is in other words presented as a rather ambivalent character, and one who potentially makes mistakes and has regrets. Given these different readings of the text, how can we think about the text as applicable today? Well, let me offer two thoughts. And as a caveat, let me clarify. These are my thoughts. You can agree or disagree with them, as you can agree or disagree with anything I've said based on your own research. But I think these two thoughts are grounded in what we've set up to this point. Thought number one, the notion of a grieving God is actually helpful. The notion of a grieving God suggests that God is thoroughly invested in the world, and that the way the world turns out has a large impact on God's own well-being. This is not to say that God needs the world to be God, but it is to suggest that God needs the world in order to be completely fulfilled in God's creative project. In other words, in making creation, God has put God's well-being at stake, at risk. This we can say is an act of love, a very risky act of love that has frequently caused God much grief. While we can fairly confidently suggest that the actual narrative of the flood in Genesis didn't happen, at least happen in that exact way, the point behind the narrative, the theological idea that God grieves, that God regrets, that human beings and the created order can have this large of an impact upon God, really makes clear the level of love, the level of risk, and the level of vulnerability that God has displayed in creating the world in the first place. The second point that I think is really interesting is that even though this is one of the most violent narratives in mythology, it is simultaneously not an affirmation of violence. In fact, in Genesis, the reason that God wants to flood the world in the first place is the violence of all flesh. In this sense, it's violence that leads God to this drastic measure. But it's also worth noting that God's own violence becomes a source of implicit regret. That God says, I'm never going to do this again. Maybe even suggesting this was a mistake, again drawing back on the way that Enlil looked at the flood in the Epoch of Atrahasis. Maybe I went too far, like when a parent scolds their child too much and afterwards goes and apologizes to them and says, that was maybe too much, I went too far. In other words, the ultimate message of the flood narrative is not that God is just in God's violence, nor that humanity's violence was acceptable. It's that ultimately what God does in being God is seeks peace. What God ultimately does is sets down God's weapon, and this is God at God's greatest, not in flooding the earth. This again helps us to rethink about how we address violence in our own time, how we think about violence, whether or not Genesis glorifies violence, or whether or not it shows that violence is so tragic that even God can be drawn into it in a way that causes regret. In this video, we did a few things. We looked at the Epoch of Atrahasis and provided a comparative analysis between that epoch and the flood narrative in the book of Genesis. We explored the flood narrative in the book of Genesis from the perspective of the character of God. And finally, we looked at a few ways that the portrayal of God's character in the flood narrative in the book of Genesis might have meaning for us today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Until next time, goodbye.